Imagine being handed off to a stranger before you've even had your first kiss. For Margaret Beaufort, this wasn't some horrible nightmare, it was her reality. At just 12 years old, she became a wife, and by 13, she was carrying the future King of England inside her tiny, undeveloped body. Her story isn't just shocking, it's the forgotten chapter of English history that shaped the Tudor dynasty. A tale of a child forced to become a woman overnight, whose strength and cunning would ultimately change the course of a nation. What Margaret endured would break most adults. But somehow, this child bride not only survived, she rewrote the rules of power in a man's world. And the most incredible part, most people have never even heard her name. Margaret was born on May 31, 1443, to one of the wealthiest families in England. Her father, John Beaufort, Duke of Somerset, died when she was just a baby, leaving her as one of the richest heiresses in the country. This wasn't the blessing you might think it was. In medieval England, a wealthy orphan girl wasn't seen as a child to be protected, she was a valuable commodity to be traded. By the time Margaret was 6 years old, King Henry VI had already sold her guardianship to his half-brothers, who immediately began planning how to profit from this little girl's marriage. Can you imagine being 6 years old and knowing your future had already been decided? While other children were playing with dolls and learning their letters, Margaret was being inspected like prized cattle by potential suitors and their families. Her childhood wasn't just cut short, it was stolen before it had properly begun. And in a world where women were valued primarily for their ability to produce heirs, Margaret's worth was calculated not by her intelligence or character, but by the lands she would bring to a marriage and the sons she might bear. By the time Margaret turned 9, she was already engaged to John de la Pole, the son of the Duke of Suffolk. But this arrangement wouldn't last. In the cutthroat world of medieval politics, alliances shifted like sand, and Margaret soon found herself caught in the middle of power struggles between England's most ambitious nobles. Her guardian, the Duke of Suffolk, fell from royal favor and was murdered, leaving Margaret's future uncertain once again. At this point in her young life, she had already been promised to one man. Then had that promise broken through no fault of her own. The engagement to John de la Pole was annulled, and Margaret, not yet 10 years old, was once again available to the highest bidder. This pattern would repeat itself throughout her early years, powerful men making decisions about her body and her future while she had no say in the matter. It's hard for us today to comprehend the complete lack of agency children like Margaret experienced. She wasn't just expected to accept these arrangements, she was expected to be grateful for them. After all, her marriage would determine her status, her safety, and her entire future in a world that offered women very few paths to security or independence. By the time Margaret reached the age of 12, King Henry VI had decided her fate once more. This time, she was to marry his half-brother, Edmund Tudor, the Earl of Richmond. Edmund was 26 years old, more than twice Margaret's age. The marriage took place in 1455, immediately after Margaret's 12th birthday. Medieval records describe it as a grand affair, with nobility from across England in attendance. But they make no mention of the bride's feelings. Did she cry as she was led to the altar? Was she terrified of what awaited her in the marriage bed? We can only imagine the fear a 12-year-old girl must have felt, being handed over to a grown man and expected to fulfill all the duties of a wife. And fulfill them she did. Edmund Tudor wasted no time in consummating the marriage, eager to secure his claim to Margaret's vast estates by getting her pregnant. Within months of the wedding, Margaret's tiny body began to change as she conceived a child. Her hips had barely begun to widen with puberty, her mind still that of a child. Yet she was already carrying the immense physical burden of pregnancy. The medical realities of a 13-year-old giving birth in the 15th century were nothing short of horrifying. Margaret's pregnancy was a dangerous time for the young girl. Her body, not yet fully developed, struggled to accommodate the growing child. She was physically tiny. Historical accounts describe her as small and slender, even as an adult, and pregnancy posed serious risks to both her and her unborn child. Modern medical experts who have studied historical cases like Margaret's confirm that pregnancy in such young girls often led to complications like eclampsia, obstructed labor, and high mortality rates for both mother and infant. As if the physical dangers weren't enough, Margaret faced them largely alone. Her husband, Edmund Tudor, was captured by Yorkist forces during the opening conflicts of what would later be called the Wars of the Roses. He died of plague in captivity in November 1456, leaving Margaret a widow at 13, still pregnant with his child. Can you imagine the terror of facing childbirth, something that regularly killed grown women in this era, as a 13-year-old girl, without the protection of a husband in war-torn medieval England? Margaret retreated to Pembroke Castle in Wales, where her brother-in-law, Jasper Tudor, offered her protection. There, she awaited the birth of her child with what must have been a mixture of fear and resignation. On January 28, 1457, after an agonizing labor that nearly killed her, Margaret gave birth to a son. She named him Henry after the king. The birth was so difficult and traumatic that the 13-year-old mother suffered permanent physical damage. She would never be able to bear another child. Think about what that means. A girl who had barely begun her own life had already reached the end of her reproductive capacity. Her body broken by a pregnancy it wasn't ready to sustain. Contemporary accounts describe how Margaret's slight frame was permanently affected by the birth, leaving her with a distinctive walk for the rest of her life. Yet despite the trauma, Margaret survived where many young mothers didn't. And her survival, along with that of her son, would eventually change the course of English history. From the moment of his birth, Margaret regarded her son Henry with an almost religious devotion. Perhaps it was because she had suffered so much to bring him into the world, or perhaps she sensed, even then, that this boy represented her only chance to make her mark on a world that had treated her as nothing more than a vessel. With a newborn son and no husband, Margaret was once again a valuable marriage prospect at just 13 years old. The nobles circling around her weren't interested in giving the young widow time to recover or raise her child. They wanted her lands and the potential influence that came with controlling Henry Tudor's inheritance. Within months of giving birth, Margaret was married again, this time to Sir Henry Stafford, the son of the Duke of Buckingham. Unlike her first husband, Stafford seems to have treated the young girl with kindness. He didn't force her to consummate the marriage immediately, perhaps aware of the physical damage she had sustained in childbirth. This second marriage offered Margaret some protection during the increasingly violent Wars of the Roses, but it came with a heavy price. She was separated from her infant son, who remained at Pembroke Castle under the guardianship of Jasper Tudor. Can you imagine the heartbreak of a 13-year-old girl forced to leave her baby behind? In the aristocratic world of medieval England, noblewomen often had little say in the raising of their children. But the separation of Margaret from Henry was particularly cruel given her age and circumstances. This forced separation would shape Margaret's character and ambitions for the rest of her life. Despite the distance, Margaret never forgot her son. From the earliest days of their separation, she fought to maintain a connection with Henry, sending letters, gifts, and trusted servants to check on his welfare. She also began to educate herself, developing a keen political mind that would serve her well in the dangerous years ahead. Margaret learned to read and write in multiple languages, studied theology and history, and quietly observed the political machinations around her. All the while, she was planning for her son's future. Even as a teenager, Margaret showed remarkable foresight and determination. She may have been powerless to prevent her marriages or keep her child with her, but she was determined to ensure that Henry would one day reclaim his Tudor heritage. This early separation from her son didn't diminish Margaret's maternal feelings. If anything, it intensified them to an almost mythic degree. She would later describe herself as the head of the Holy Trinity on earth, with Henry as the Son, and his father as the Holy Ghost. This religious framing of her maternity would become central to Margaret's identity and purpose. As the Wars of the Roses intensified, Margaret's position became increasingly precarious. Her Tudor connections tied her to the Lancastrian cause, while her various marriages pulled her in different political directions. When Edward IV, the Yorkist king, seized the throne in 1461, Margaret had to navigate carefully to protect both herself and her son's interests. By this point, Henry Tudor was living in the household of Lord Herbert, a Yorkist supporter who had purchased his wardship. Margaret was allowed occasional visits with her son, but she had no control over his upbringing or education. She watched from a distance as her only child was raised by strangers, taught to be loyal to the very faction that had overthrown the Lancastrian dynasty to which he was connected by blood. For many women, this would have been enough to break their spirit. But Margaret was not most women. Behind her carefully composed exterior and her performance of proper feminine submission, she was developing a network of allies and informants that would later prove invaluable. She began to cultivate a reputation for piety and learning, becoming known for her religious devotions and her patronage of scholars. This public image of the devout noblewoman provided perfect cover for her political activities. The political tides shifted again in 1470 when the Lancastrian king, Henry VI, was briefly restored to the throne. Margaret's son, Henry, now 13, was reunited with his uncle, Jasper Tudor. But this reunion was short-lived. When Edward IV reclaimed the crown in 1471, Jasper fled to Brittany, taking young Henry with him. Margaret's son was now in exile. Living at the mercy of foreign rulers, his Tudor blood and potential claim to the English throne made him both valuable and vulnerable. For Margaret, now in her late 20s and on her third marriage to Thomas Stanley, her second husband having died in battle, the stakes had never been higher. Her son was beyond her reach, in constant danger, and his future completely uncertain. During this period, Margaret began to take even greater risks, secretly corresponding with Lancastrian exiles and working to keep her son's name alive in influential circles. She played a dangerous game, maintaining the appearance of loyalty to the Yorkist regime while quietly preparing for the day when her son might return to claim his birthright. And all the while, she built her reputation as a woman of exceptional piety and learning. Margaret's religious devotion was both genuine and strategic. In an age when women were largely excluded from formal power, religion offered one of the few socially acceptable avenues for female influence. Margaret embraced this opportunity, becoming known for her strict religious observances, her generous donations to the church, and her patronage of religious scholars. She fasted regularly, wore a hair shirt beneath her fine clothes, and followed a strict daily schedule of prayers. This public piety earned her respect and a certain level of protection. After all, who would suspect such a devout woman of harboring political ambitions? Behind this facade of humble devotion, however, Margaret was steadily expanding her network of contacts and her personal wealth. She managed her estates with remarkable skill, increasing her income and investing in property and business ventures. By the time she reached her 30s, she had become one of the wealthiest and most influential women in England. Despite having been married off as a child and separated from her only son, her third husband, Lord Stanley, gave her significant freedom to manage her own affairs. Perhaps recognizing her exceptional abilities or simply preferring to focus on his own political maneuvering. The death of Edward IV in 1483 and the subsequent usurpation of the throne by Richard III created new opportunities and dangers for Margaret and her exiled son. Richard III declared Margaret's son Henry, now in his mid-20s, a traitor and seized her lands and titles. Margaret herself was placed under house arrest in her husband's custody, her movements restricted and her communications monitored. Yet even under these constraints, she continued to work tirelessly for her son's cause. Using trusted servants and coded messages, Margaret maintained contact with Henry in exile and with his growing number of supporters in England. She pledged her vast wealth to his cause and negotiated a remarkable marriage alliance between Henry and Elizabeth of York, the daughter of Edward IV and niece of Richard III. This potential union would unite the Lancaster and York factions, strengthening Henry's claim to the throne. Margaret's political acumen was on full display in these negotiations. She understood that her son needed to offer healing to a kingdom torn apart by decades of civil war, and a marriage that bridged the warring houses was the perfect symbolic gesture. In 1485, after years of exile and careful planning, Henry Tudor landed in Wales with a small army of French and Scottish mercenaries. Margaret, still under house arrest, could not openly support her son's invasion, but she continued to work behind the scenes, sending money and information through secret channels. Her husband, Lord Stanley, played a crucial role in the conflict that followed. At the Battle of Bosworth Field, Stanley held back his forces until the critical moment, then committed them to Henry's side, helping to secure victory against Richard III. Whether Margaret influenced this decision remains a matter of historical debate, but the outcome was undeniable. On August 22, 1485, Richard III was killed in battle, and Margaret's only son, the boy she had given birth to at 13, was proclaimed King Henry VII of England. According to contemporary accounts, when the crown was recovered from the battlefield, it was Lord Stanley who placed it on Henry's head. In that moment, the 30-year-old woman who had once been a child bride had achieved what must have seemed impossible. Her son, born in such difficult circumstances, was now king, and Margaret Beaufort, the girl who had been treated as property, was now the king's mother. Henry VII's coronation marked the beginning of a new era for both England and for Margaret personally. Now known as My Lady, the King's Mother, she was given unprecedented privileges and authority. She adopted the signature Margaret R. Regina, or Queen, was allowed to live independently of her husband, and was granted lands and estates that made her one of the wealthiest individuals in the kingdom. Henry relied heavily on his mother's counsel, appreciating her political instincts and her network of loyal supporters. Margaret's apartments at court adjoined the king's, giving her regular private access to the new monarch. She also developed a close relationship with her daughter-in-law, Elizabeth of York, whose marriage to Henry had united the warring houses just as Margaret had planned. When Elizabeth gave birth to her first son, Arthur, in 1486, Margaret was given the honor of planning the christening ceremony. For a woman who had been forced to give up her own son as an infant, this must have been a particularly poignant privilege. Margaret poured her considerable organizational skills into creating elaborate and politically symbolic ceremonies for her grandchildren, establishing traditions that would influence royal celebrations for generations to come. Margaret's influence extended far beyond the royal nursery. She served on the King's Council, helped shape government policy, and oversaw the reform of royal finances. She acted as regent when Henry was abroad, effectively ruling England in his absence. This level of female political authority was virtually unprecedented in medieval England. While other royal mothers had exercised influence through their sons, few had been granted the formal powers that Margaret enjoyed. She also became a significant patron of education and the arts, founding colleges at Oxford and Cambridge, supporting the new technology of printing, and commissioning translations of important religious texts. Margaret even rewrote the rules of royal etiquette, creating new protocols that emphasized the dignity and sacred nature of monarchy. In a very real sense, she helped to create the image and the institutions of Tudor kingship that would define the dynasty for the next century. Her traumatic early life had given her a unique perspective on power and vulnerability, and she used this understanding to help her son establish a secure and stable reign after decades of civil war. Margaret outlived her son, Henry VII, witnessing the accession of her grandson, the infamous Henry VIII, in 1509. By then, she was in her mid-60s, an impressive age for the medieval era, and had lived long enough to see her direct descendant secure on the English throne. Margaret died on June 29, 1509, just months after her grandson's coronation. Her funeral was a grand state occasion, reflecting her status as the matriarch of the Tudor dynasty. She was buried in Westminster Abbey, where her tomb can still be seen today. The inscription identifies her as Margaret of Richmond, mother of Henry VII, grandmother of Henry VIII, acknowledging her central role in establishing the Tudor line. Looking back at Margaret's extraordinary life, trajectory from child bride to king's mother to virtual co-ruler of England, it's hard not to be amazed by her resilience and determination. The girl who had been married at 12 and given birth at 13 had survived to become one of the most powerful women in English history. A woman whose political skills and strategic thinking helped to end a civil war and establish a dynasty that would rule England for over a century. Margaret's story forces us to confront uncomfortable realities about how children, particularly girls, were treated in medieval society. Her first marriage and pregnancy would be considered child abuse by modern standards, yet they were accepted practices among the nobility of her time. Girls like Margaret were viewed primarily as vehicles for the transmission of property and the production of male heirs, their own well-being and development secondary to these functions. The physical cost to Margaret was severe. The difficult birth left her unable to have more children and likely caused her ongoing health issues throughout her life. Yet from this trauma, she developed an extraordinary bond with her only son, a relationship that would shape both of their destinies. Margaret's devotion to Henry went beyond ordinary maternal love. It became the central purpose of her existence, driving her to take political risks and develop skills that were unusual for women of her era. Her single-minded focus on advancing her son's interests transformed her from a victim of circumstance into an architect of history. Margaret's legacy lives on not just in the Tudor dynasty she helped establish, but in the educational institutions she founded. Christ's College and St. John's College at Cambridge University owe their existence to her patronage and vision. She established the Lady Margaret Professorships of Divinity at both Oxford and Cambridge, positions that still exist today. Her support for early English printers helped to spread literacy and learning beyond the traditional monastic centers. Margaret herself was an author, translating religious works from French into English and writing a guide to household management that reflected her organizational skills. She was also one of the first English nobles to recognize the importance of public image, carefully crafting her persona as a devout, learned, and dignified matriarch. The portraits commissioned during her lifetime show her in modest widow's clothing, often at prayer, presenting an image of pious humility that belied her considerable political power. This careful management of her public image helped to make her authority more acceptable in a society deeply uncomfortable with female power. Despite her extraordinary influence and achievements, Margaret Beaufort has been largely overlooked in popular understandings of English history. She doesn't feature prominently in films or television series about the Tudors, which tend to focus on her more flamboyant descendants, Henry VIII and Elizabeth I, when she does appear in historical fiction. She's often portrayed as a cold, calculating, and overly religious woman, a one-dimensional character rather than the complex individual revealed in historical records. This simplistic view fails to consider the trauma and challenges she faced from childhood and the remarkable ways in which she overcame them. It also reflects our continuing discomfort with powerful women who don't conform to modern ideals of femininity or motherhood. Margaret wasn't warm and nurturing in the conventional sense. She wasn't even allowed to raise her own child. But her lifelong dedication to her son's welfare and success speaks to a profound maternal commitment that transcended physical separation. Her religious devotion, far from being merely performative, provided her with both spiritual comfort and practical cover for her political activities. What might Margaret Beaufort's life tell us about resilience, trauma, and the human capacity to transform suffering into strength? Born into a world that valued her only for her inheritance and her reproductive capacity, she nevertheless managed to develop her intellectual gifts and political talents. Married as a child and physically damaged by an early pregnancy, she channeled her maternal feelings into a grand political project that ultimately changed the course of English history. The girl who had no control over her own body or her child's upbringing eventually helped to create the educational institutions, court protocols, and political alliances that would shape a dynasty. In many ways, Margaret's story is a master class and working within severe constraints to achieve extraordinary ends. She never openly rebelled against the patriarchal structures of her society. Indeed, she presented herself as a model of feminine piety and propriety, but she navigated those structures to accumulate influence and authority that few women of her era could claim. She played the long game, sometimes waiting decades for her carefully laid plans to bear fruit. Margaret's relationship with power offers particularly interesting insights into how marginalized individuals can exert influence in hostile systems. Unable to claim power directly in her own name, she instead built a network of indirect influence through patronage, marriage alliances, and the careful cultivation of her public image. She worked through trusted intermediaries, using her wealth to reward loyalty and her religious reputation to deflect suspicion. When she did eventually gain formal authority as the king's mother, she exercised it with remarkable skill, balancing assertiveness with the appearance of proper feminine submission to maintain her position. Margaret understood that her power was always contingent and potentially fragile in a male-dominated world. So she took care to justify her unusual authority through her son's interests and the greater good of the realm. This strategic approach to power, working through and around institutional barriers, rather than directly challenging them, has been employed by women and other marginalized groups throughout history, when direct paths to authority have been blocked. Margaret's success in this regard makes her not just a fascinating historical figure, but a case study in effective influence under constraints. The world that Margaret Beaufort inhabited is in many ways unimaginably distant from our own. Child marriages are now recognized as the human rights violations they are. Girls are valued for their minds and potential, not just their reproductive capacity or family connections. Women can hold power in their own right, not just through their relationships to powerful men. Yet aspects of Margaret's experience continue to resonate. The exploitation of children, particularly girls, remains a global problem. Women in many societies still struggle to have their intellectual and leadership abilities recognized, and the need to navigate hostile power structures with strategic intelligence is a reality for marginalized groups worldwide. Perhaps this is why Margaret's story feels surprisingly modern despite its medieval setting. She was dealing with extreme versions of challenges that persist in various forms today. Her responses to these challenges, education, strategic alliance building, careful image management, and the cultivation of specialized knowledge remain relevant tactics for those seeking to overcome structural disadvantages. Margaret's life reminds us that even in the most restrictive circumstances, human beings find ways to exercise agency and pursue their goals. As we reflect on Margaret Beaufort's extraordinary journey from child bride to king's mother, it's worth considering what her story reveals about the relationship between personal trauma and historical impact. Would Margaret have become such a formidable political operator if she hadn't experienced the violations of early marriage and motherhood? Would she have developed the same fierce determination to advance her son's interests if she had been allowed to raise him herself? These questions have no definitive answers, but they invite us to consider how adversity shapes character and ambition. Margaret's early experiences of powerlessness seem to have instilled in her a determination to secure power whenever and however she could. Her separation from her child appears to have intensified, rather than diminished, her maternal commitment, transforming it into a dynastic project with national implications. The very traumas that might have broken her instead forged her into a woman of exceptional resilience and strategic vision. This is not to romanticize suffering or suggest that trauma is necessary for greatness. Margaret's abilities might have found equally impressive expression under more humane circumstances, but it does highlight the human capacity to derive meaning and purpose from even the most difficult experiences. Margaret's story also raises important questions about how we judge historical figures across the vast gulf of time and changing moral standards. By modern standards, her marriage at 12 and pregnancy at 13 were abuses that no child should endure. Yet Margaret herself, shaped by the religious and social values of her time, likely viewed her early marriage and motherhood as her duty, rather than a violation. She came from a world where childhood as we understand it barely existed, especially for girls of noble birth, who were seen as adults once they reached puberty. This doesn't make what happened to her any less harmful from a medical or psychological perspective, but it does complicate how we understand her own experience of these events. Similarly, while we might admire Margaret's political acumen and determination, some of her actions in pursuit of her son's interests were ruthless by any standard. She was willing to risk civil war to put Henry on the throne. With all the bloodshed that entailed, she helped to arrange the execution of potential rivals to secure the Tudor succession. These actions reflect both the brutal political realities of her era and her own unwavering commitment to her family's advancement. What endures about Margaret Beaufort's legacy is not just the Tudor dynasty she helped to establish or the educational institutions she founded, but the example she provides of female agency in an era when women had few formal paths to power. Margaret never openly challenged the patriarchal structures of her society. Indeed, She carefully maintained the appearance of proper feminine submission, but she skillfully worked within and around those structures to achieve her goals. She used the limited tools available to women of her time: marriage alliances, maternal influence, religious devotion, patronage, wealth management, to accumulate extraordinary influence. In doing so, she created templates for female power that would be followed by other ambitious women in the Tudor era and beyond. Her grandsons, 6 wives, her great-granddaughter, Elizabeth I, and countless less famous noblewomen would draw on strategies that Margaret had pioneered. In this sense, her legacy extends beyond her direct contributions to English history to encompass broader patterns of how women have navigated power structures designed to exclude them. Margaret Beaufort, the child bride who became the king's mother, reminds us that even in the most constrained circumstances, human beings find ways to shape their world. As we conclude our exploration of Margaret Beaufort's remarkable life, it's worth reflecting on why her story matters today. Beyond its inherent dramatic appeal, the child bride who rose to become a king's mother and a power behind the throne, Margaret's journey offers insights into resilience, strategic thinking, and the complex ways in which individuals navigate oppressive systems. Her life demonstrates how trauma can be transformed, though never erased, through the pursuit of meaningful goals. It shows how indirect forms of influence can sometimes achieve what direct power cannot. And it reminds us that behind the grand narratives of kings and battles that dominate traditional histories, there are often overlooked figures, particularly women whose actions and decisions shaped events in profound ways. Margaret Beaufort, married at 12 and pregnant at 13, went on to help found a dynasty that would rule England for over a century and establish institutions that continue to this day. Her story challenges us to look beyond conventional historical narratives to discover the full complexity of the past and the remarkable individuals who inhabited it.